In June, amid the golden fields, I saw a groundhog lying dead. Dead he lay, my senses shook, and mind outshot our naked frailty. There, lowly in the vigorous summer, his form began its senseless change, and made my senses waver dim, seeing nature ferocious in him. Inspecting close his maggot's might, and seething cauldron of his being, half with loathing, half with a strange love, I poked him with an angry stick. The fever arose, became a flame, and vigor circumscribed the skies, immense energy in the sun, and through my frame a sunless trembling. My stick had done no good nor harm, then stood I silent in the day, watching the object, as before, and kept my reverence for knowledge, trying for control, to be still, to quell the passion of the blood, until I had bent down on my knees, praying for joy in the sign of decay. And so I left, and I returned in autumn, strict of eye, to see the sap gone out of the groundhog. But the bony sudden hulk remained, but the year had lost its meaning, and in intellectual chains I lost both love and loathing, murred up in the wall of wisdom. Another summer took the fields again, massive and burning, full of life. But when I chanced upon the spot, there was only a little hair left, the bones bleached in the sunlight, beautiful as architecture. I watched them like a geometer, and cut a walking stick from a birch. It has been 3 years now. There is no sign of the groundhog. I stood there in the whirling summer, my hand clapped a withered heart, and thought of China and of Greece, of Alexander in his tent, of Montaigne in his tower, of Saint Teresa in her wild lament.
Hey guys, so the title of this poem is A Groundhog, and it's pretty straightforward. The poem is about a groundhog, but also the groundhog is used symbolically and ironically because they're usually associated with spring, but the poem is about death. So the first few lines start out and they lay out the setting, which is June, and it's in a field. And because it's golden, you can think of it as a wheat field. And so the narrator comes across the groundhog and he is very shaken. And he seems to lose his ability to think rationally when he sees the groundhog. In the next few lines, he sees maggots on the groundhog, which remind him that there are other forms of life that are involved with death. So the death of one thing does not mean the death of everything. It's all a cycle and everything's connected. And so the fact that something dies but something else lives on is kind of a cruel image, and the author feels this, or the narrator feels this. So in these next few lines, the narrator, who is kind of shocked with this image and who wants to intervene, he tries to poke the groundhog, and it really doesn't help. So he feels frustrated at his inability to change the death of the groundhog, and also um, becomes aware that he cannot change his own mortality. So in these next few lines, the setting now changes to the fall, and so it seems as though it's the autumn directly after the summer of the last scene. So this is um, a couple of months later, and so the groundhog is still decaying, and the author again is he feels a certain pity for the groundhog, and he hates the fact that he is dead and that he is decaying. So here the author is again in the summer, so this is a year after it started, and the author is now able to think more rationally, and he looks at the bones and he's no longer appalled by the groundhog. He now thinks it is beautiful. Okay, so in these last few lines, this is 2 years after the last scene and 3 years after the beginning scene. So the author is now able to remove all emotional attachment from the groundhog, and um, he mentions that he sees he's thinking of China and Greece and Alexander, and all of those were great civilizations which had very um, glorious days, and they all eventually fell. And so that's just like how the groundhog at one point was probably living a healthy life, and then he died and he decayed. And so the same thing goes for Montaigne, who was a French philosopher, and Saint Teresa, who was a Catholic saint. And so for Soapstone, the speaker is a man who enjoys taking walks, and the occasion is in this field, and it takes place um, on three different times across the span of 3 years. The audience is a general audience, um, because we all have to deal with death at one point, and we all grow old too, so we are all mortal. We all can relate to this. And the purpose is to emphasize the continuous cycle of life, but also to bring into question a person's mortality and what the knowledge of mortality does. At the beginning, the narrator felt like didn't really, he couldn't really think, and he just felt a strong emotion and hatred towards death, perhaps because he was scared of his own death. But as time went on, he started to realize that this is just a natural process, and he started to accept it. And he probably decided to continue to live his own life as though like death wouldn't come, because you really shouldn't be uh, like at the beginning of the poem where he really couldn't think or do anything other than just be fearful of death. And the subject of the tone is the author um, not only finding a dead groundhog, but continuously coming back to check on the groundhog. And the tone of this poem is inquisitive and uneasy, and at the beginning it's pretty ambivalent, and then he grows more rational towards the end.